In the quiet suburbs of Ohio, a family home stood as a symbol of love and resilience. For years, it had been a place where memories were made, where siblings grew up laughing, and where a mother worked tirelessly to create a safe haven. But one night, that home became the site of an unspeakable tragedy. On a chilly evening, fire engulfed the house, leaving neighbors horrified and emergency responders scrambling to contain the blaze. The flames tore through the structure with an intensity that seemed almost unnatural. By the time it was over, the house was reduced to ashes, and a mother and her young children had lost their lives. As investigators combed through the charred remains, they discovered that this was no accident. Accelerants were found, pointing to a deliberate act of violence. The community demanded answers. Who could commit such an atrocity? What could drive someone to destroy a family in such a horrific way? And then came the revelation that sent shockwaves through the town: the suspect wasn't a stranger. She wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in the night. She was someone the family knew. Someone they trusted. This is the story of a young woman whose heartbreak became fuel for an unthinkable act. A story of betrayal, vengeance, and the devastating consequences of unchecked rage. How did a romantic relationship unravel so catastrophically? What led her to take such a devastating step? Tonight, we'll uncover the events that led to that fatal night, the investigation that followed, and the answers that left an entire town reeling. This is the story of the fire that changed everything. This is the devastating story of a love gone toxic, leading to one of Ohio's most horrifying crimes in 2022. A story that began with a seemingly ordinary relationship and ended with an unimaginable loss of life. As we piece together the events leading up to that fateful night, we'll uncover the fractured relationships, the emotional unraveling, and the devastating choices that forever altered the lives of everyone involved. Stay tuned as we unravel the chilling details behind this tragedy. Through interviews, evidence, and a careful reconstruction of events, we'll take you step by step through a case that reveals just how far the human heart can go when pushed to its limits. And as we examine this tragedy, we'll also ask ourselves, how could this have been prevented? Were there warning signs that everyone missed? Or was this outcome inevitable? If you're passionate about uncovering the mysteries behind real-life crimes, we encourage you to subscribe to our channel. Our mission is to shed light on stories like this, not just for the sake of justice, but to honor the lives impacted and to learn from the events that unfolded. Hit the subscribe button below and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And remember, your engagement helps us continue to bring you these deeply impactful stories. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To understand this story, we need to understand the people involved and the lives they led before everything fell apart. Our story begins in a small, unassuming town in Ohio, a place where everyone knows each other's name and where life feels predictable, until one event forever changed the lives of many. In 2022, a devastating act of violence would shake this quiet town to its core. Shanice Williams was a young woman with big dreams. Raised in a family where love was plentiful but stability was sometimes hard to come by, Shanice learned early on how to navigate emotional turbulence. She had a complicated relationship with her past, often feeling torn between ambition and a yearning for genuine connection. Shanice wanted a love she could depend on, a partner who could offer her the emotional stability she craved. And she thought she found that with her boyfriend. She met him during a difficult period in her life. His name was Derek Matthews, a man who was both charming and confident. Derek had a way with words, and for a while, he seemed to be everything Shanice needed. A self-assured man who made her feel like she was the center of his world, he was everything she had dreamed of. Derek was well-liked, with a good job in the local area, and a natural charisma that drew people in. The connection was immediate, and soon Shanice was deeply invested in him. They spent time together in the early stages of their relationship, bonding over shared interests and long conversations. Shanice would later describe their connection as something special, almost magical at first. But as time went on, cracks began to show. Derek, despite his outward charm, carried his own baggage. His behavior became increasingly unpredictable, and he wasn't as emotionally available as Shanice had hoped. Yet, despite the growing distance, Shanice clung to the relationship, convinced that love would prevail. Derek's family was a pillar in this small town. They were a close-knit unit, led by Derek's mother, Linda Matthews. Linda was a kind, hard-working woman, a nurse who had dedicated her life to caring for others. She raised Derek and his siblings, Jasmine and Trey, with a deep sense of love and responsibility. Family meant everything to Linda, and she poured all her energy into ensuring that her children had a good upbringing. Jasmine, Derek's older sister, had always been his protector. A strong and independent woman, Jasmine was quick to stand up for her family. Trey, the youngest at just 16 years old, was full of potential. He had his whole life ahead of him, his future filled with possibilities. The Matthews family had weathered many storms, but nothing could prepare them for the storm that would soon tear through their lives. For a time, Derek's relationship with Shanice seemed harmless to his family. They knew that Derek could be a bit distant at times, but they trusted him to make his own choices. However, when Derek began to act more distant and secretive, his family started to notice. And while they didn't know the full extent of his actions, they could see the changes in him. His relationship with Shanice was becoming strained. The tension was palpable, but no one could have predicted how this would all unfold. Shanice, feeling rejected and betrayed, decided to confront the issue head-on. But the discovery she would soon make shattered everything. Derek's infidelity, an affair he had been hiding for months, was uncovered. This revelation tore at Shanice's heart, but it also ignited something much darker within her. The betrayal she felt became overwhelming, and it wasn't just about losing Derek, it was about losing the future she thought they would have together. That betrayal would set into motion a series of events that would forever change the Matthews family. But the story of what happened next isn't just about a relationship falling apart, it's about what happens when pain and anger are left unchecked. In the next segment, we'll dive deeper into the chilling crime that occurred, the night that shattered the lives of the Matthews family, and the explosive consequences of Shanice's heartbreak. It was a seemingly ordinary evening in the quiet Ohio town, but inside the Matthews home, an explosion of emotion was about to take place. The night of the fire would change everything, leaving a family shattered and a community grappling with the horror of what had occurred. The sequence of events that led to the devastating fire started with a confrontation. A confrontation between Shanice and Derek. After weeks of suspicion and mounting emotional turmoil, Shanice finally discovered the truth. Derek had been seeing another woman for months, a woman who had taken the place she once occupied in his life. Shanice had been fighting her emotions for so long, trying to hold on to a relationship that had already unraveled. But this revelation was the breaking point. Derek, instead of comforting her or offering any kind of remorse, responded with indifference. To him, it was just another mistake, something that didn't require much more than a few empty apologies. That indifference, the emotional coldness, was the final spark. Shanice had already been harboring a deep sense of betrayal, but now she was consumed by something darker. That night, Shanice made a choice. A choice that no one, least of all Derek, could have anticipated. Shanice left Derek's home and drove to the Matthews family residence. It wasn't just the pain of the affair that drove her, it was the deep, uncontrollable rage that had built up over the weeks. Derek's family had always been kind to her, yet now she felt betrayed by them too. In her mind, they were complicit in the relationship's failure, standing by as everything she believed in slipped away. At approximately 2 a.m., Shanice arrived at the Matthews house. She knew the family would be asleep, unaware of the storm brewing outside. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dim street lamps outside. It was the perfect moment for her to make a statement that would not only end Derek's relationship with her but also destroy his family. Shanice approached the back of the house. Her mind was racing, but one thing was crystal clear, she wanted Derek to feel the same devastation she had. She wanted him to understand the depths of her pain. And in her twisted logic, she believed that if she couldn't have him, neither could anyone else. Shanice had brought gasoline with her. She poured it strategically around the house, on the porch, the windows, the door. The smell of gasoline filled the night air. As she stood there, in that moment of utter chaos, she lit a match. She watched as the flames began to rise, growing taller, hotter, consuming the porch and creeping toward the house. It didn't take long before the entire structure was ablaze. Shanice stood there for a moment, watching the fire grow. She didn't flee immediately. She watched as the flames started to devour the Matthews family's home, the heat rising in the air. The house began to crackle, the sound of the fire reverberating through the quiet neighborhood. Then, as if suddenly realizing the enormity of what she had just done, she fled the scene. The fire quickly spread throughout the house, filling the rooms with smoke and flames. Linda, Jasmine, and Trey, unaware of the danger, were trapped inside. The fire department was alerted, but by the time they arrived, it was already too late. The house was engulfed in flames, and the damage was catastrophic. The firefighters battled the fire, but the situation grew worse by the minute. When the fire was finally extinguished, what they found inside was nothing short of heartbreaking. Linda, Jasmine, and Trey, 3 innocent lives, had been taken by the inferno that Shanice had set in motion. The heat had been so intense that the damage to their bodies was almost unrecognizable. In the midst of the devastation, one thing was clear: this was no accident. Someone had intended to cause this destruction. Shanice's betrayal had gone far beyond what anyone could have imagined. But in the wake of this horrific crime, a question remained: what drove a woman, who once sought love and acceptance, to commit such an unthinkable act of violence? As dawn broke over Ohio, the town was still reeling from the events of the night before. The Matthews family's house was reduced to ash, their lives shattered in a matter of hours. But for law enforcement, this was just the beginning of a long, complex investigation that would unravel a disturbing trail of clues, and eventually, lead to Shanice. Local authorities were the first on the scene, with the fire department already having worked tirelessly to contain the blaze. However, the severity of the fire made it clear that this wasn't an ordinary case. The firefighters, in their assessment, quickly ruled that the fire was intentionally set. The spread of the flames was too uniform, the ignition too rapid. Detectives began their investigation, but there was little to go on at first. No witnesses had seen anything unusual, and there was no immediate sign of a break-in. But something stood out. Among the debris, the investigators found the remnants of a gasoline can. Its metallic sheen, still visible despite the fire's intensity, was enough to send a clear signal. This was no accident, it was arson. As the fire department worked to clear the scene, detectives began canvassing the neighborhood. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have seen something unusual that night. But it wasn't until they spoke with Derek that the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Derek, visibly shaken by the fire and the loss of his family, was initially reluctant to discuss Shanice. But as the detectives pressed him, he reluctantly admitted that their relationship had ended violently. He explained that Shanice had been devastated after learning of his infidelity, but he had no idea that she would go so far as to harm his family. Derek told the police that Shanice had recently shown signs of emotional instability, but he never suspected she would resort to violence. As the investigation continued, a breakthrough came when Shanice's whereabouts were traced. She had driven from Derek's house to the Matthews home just hours before the fire. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station confirmed that Shanice had purchased gasoline that night, confirming the investigators' suspicions. She had prepared herself to destroy everything Derek held dear. At the same time, police learned of Shanice's movements after the fire. Witnesses reported seeing her return to her apartment in the early hours of the morning, her clothing singed and her demeanor strangely composed. When confronted by authorities, Shanice initially denied any involvement in the fire. But the evidence was stacking up against. Shanice initially denied any involvement in the fire. But as the evidence piled up, her story began to unravel. Detectives found security camera footage from her apartment complex showing her entering the building around 3 a.m., just hours after the fire began. In the footage, her clothes appeared singed, and she seemed unusually calm for someone who had just experienced the kind of trauma that could accompany such a violent act. The most damning evidence, however, came when investigators took a closer look at Shanice's phone records. In the days leading up to the fire, there were multiple text messages exchanged between her and Derek. While Derek had told police that their relationship was over, Shanice was desperate. Her texts were filled with anger, frustration, and pleading. Among the numerous messages Shanice sent Derek in the days leading up to the fire, one stood out in particular. It wasn't just angry or emotional, it was threatening. Hours before the fire, Shanice sent Derek a message that would send a cold chill down his spine. "Hope your family enjoys the heat tonight. Let's see if they like it as much as you do." Those words, cold, calculated, and filled with vengeance, became the final confirmation that Shanice's rage had consumed her. To her, it was no longer just about betrayal, it was about punishment. And she had already made her move. The heat she referred to wasn't just metaphorical, it was the fire she had set, the one that would soon claim the lives of the people Derek loved most. This message sent an unmistakable signal to investigators. It wasn't just the words, but the timing. Shanice had already made her decision, and she was warning Derek, even if he didn't understand the full extent of the threat. With the evidence mounting, Shanice's behavior became more suspicious. Her family and friends were interviewed, and many described her as distant, angry, and unpredictable in the weeks leading up to the fire. They said she had become consumed with thoughts of betrayal and revenge. Her obsession with Derek's new relationship was clear to everyone who knew her, but no one could have anticipated how far she would go to exact her revenge. Shanice's arrest came only days after the fire, as detectives were able to track her down at a relative's home in a neighboring town. She was taken into custody without incident. The emotional toll of her actions had begun to weigh on her, but she still refused to speak about the fire. For hours, she sat in silence in the interrogation room, her head bowed, as if she were trying to come to terms with what she had done. But when Shanice's arrest sent shockwaves through the town, but the real revelations came during her trial. What the court discovered about Shanice's state of mind and the events leading up to the fire turned out to be far darker than anyone could have imagined. As Shanice stood trial for the murder of Derek's family, the courtroom was filled with emotional testimony. Derek, still visibly shaken by the events, took the stand to recount the final moments of his family's life. His voice cracked as he spoke about his mother and siblings, how they had tried to save each other from the fire. He explained that he never expected Shanice to go so far, despite the warnings she had given him. He even spoke about the text message she had sent him, one that he could never forget, one that would forever haunt him: "Hope your family enjoys the heat tonight. Let's see if they like it as much as you do." The defense tried to paint Shanice as emotionally disturbed, a woman scorned by betrayal and left to fester in her hurt and anger. They argued that while her actions were extreme, they were the result of years of emotional torment. But for the prosecution, there was no excuse. Shanice had planned and carried out the attack with cold precision. She had sought revenge, and the lives lost could never be replaced. One of the most disturbing pieces of evidence presented in court was Shanice's mental state in the aftermath of the fire. Psychologists who evaluated her testified that while she had been in an emotionally distressed state, they could not find any evidence of true mental illness. Shanice had made a conscious decision to carry out the arson, knowing full well the risk of death involved. It wasn't an accident, it was murder, plain and simple. Despite the attempts to frame her actions as a result of heartbreak, the court saw through Shanice's defense. The jury deliberated for several days, but when the verdict was finally read, there was no question in anyone's mind about what Shanice had done. Shanice was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and arson. The courtroom was silent as the judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no joy in the conviction. For Derek, his family was gone, and no sentence could ever bring them back. But the justice served brought a small sense of closure to the families who had been affected by Shanice's actions. This tragic story is a stark reminder of how unchecked emotions, betrayal, and rage can have catastrophic consequences. What began as a painful breakup spiraled into a nightmare that forever changed the lives of Derek and his family. Shanice's actions were premeditated and deadly, yet, in her mind, it was simply revenge. Do you think justice was truly served in this case? Was Shanice a victim of her circumstances, or was she simply a woman who chose to exact a deadly form of revenge? We want to hear your thoughts. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a true crime story like this. And be sure to share this video with anyone who might want to learn more about the tragic case of Shanice and the Matthews family. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes TH.